Imagine luminaria sparkling in the frosty night, the tantalizing smells of biscochitos and pozole, the sounds of festive singing, and the warmth of joyous gathering. That must have been 2019 and maybe 2021, but we know the holidays will be different in 2020. And the folks at New Mexico State Historic Sites are already planning some extra special online celebrations deeply rooted in our Southwestern traditions.
Welcome to Augmented Humanity. Our guests are modern explorers working at the intersection of technology and the humanities. They help us to understand ourselves and the worlds we create in this digital age. They are thinkers, creators, makers, and academics working in diverse fields like linguistics, technology, game and object design, and ethics. I'm your host, Craig Goldsmith.
I'm your host, Ellen Dornan.
On this program, we're joined by Patrick Moore and Tim Roberts, the Director and Deputy Director of New Mexico Historic Sites, a division of the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs.
Thank you both so much for taking the time to talk with us today about this packed calendar of programs you have coming up. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what people can expect come December?
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting us today. A lot of exciting things happening, and I know that we've all been through this process of the last 9 months now. And how do we grapple through that? It's been difficult. A lot of people are suffering. We have looked at the opportunities we have here of how can we do something that's meaningful? How can we do something that's engaging for our publics who may not be able to come to our sites directly? And so we've spent the last, closing in on 9 months now, grappling with those very difficult realities. And we were fortunate within New Mexico Historic Sites because we set ourselves on the right path years ago. When we started hiring back in 2016, we had sort of a new vision for how we're going to engage with our publics in dynamic ways, connecting our historic sites so they're not operating as silos, but rather they are collective units that tell the bigger story in New Mexico. And in that, we were hiring professionals, people who were trained as public historians, as educators, as communicators in really dynamic ways. I think in some ways it's safe to say that we had been moving slowly in the direction of telling broader stories, but it really wasn't until now that we were able to create new dynamic programming and really elevate what we're doing. Going back in March, it was our cabinet secretary, Garcia Griego, who said really challenged all of the divisions, all of our museums, historic sites, even our state libraries, and the arts program. How do we engage in different ways? And for many, it was a little bit of a head scratch. We expect people to come through our doors, and that's why we stand there. And so with that, we jumped forward. We started working around curriculum standards, creating programming. We created dozens of virtual classroom programs, and then we moved into virtual summer camp programs. We've done concerts, and the connection has been great. And so we were open for a brief time, but when we shut down again, the question was, how can we turn something really difficult for a lot of people into something wonderful? And knowing that we've had years of our programming underway that we do every season, probably our busiest time of the year in historic sites, with all of our major headline programs, we said, how can we flip the ball? How can we then make something that is always in person into something virtual? We got the staff excited about, well, why do we have to just do that? Why can't we do something that's a series of events that people can enjoy throughout the season? And we kind of avoid using Christmas or holidays because we have a lot of different cultures in the state that view things through different lenses. And how do we engage with those, present those, and provide it? And Tim has been critical in working with our instructional coordinators and our rangers in making that happen. So I'll pass that to Tim, who can give you just a little taste of where we're going.
As Patrick said, this is certainly a unique time to be a public interpreter, especially in terms of interpreting history and culture and stories at historic sites, because we so often fall back on the idea of place-based history, telling stories where these stories happen. And that's really the hallmark of our interpretive strategy at historic sites. So, as Patrick mentioned, over the last 9 months, our educators and our interpreters have really had to think creatively about engaging with new communities in new ways and taking those stories of place-based history into a broader context. So we have had quite a bit of experience over the last 9 months. We've learned a lot about how to engage with these communities. There's not one singular community that we work with, and there are a multitude of audiences that we're reaching out to. And we've had a lot of successes, and we've learned quite a bit about how to go about that in a meaningful way. So moving into, as Patrick said, our busiest seasons of the year, the holiday season, where we do get to celebrate so many amazing multicultural traditions here in New Mexico, and we really get to showcase the historic sites, and no pun intended, in new light some ways. we now have some experience under our belt, and our interpreters, our rangers, our educators, they really are thinking creatively about how to take those experiences and transition them to a digital medium. So we are certainly going to highlight some of our traditional programs that we have during the end of the year season, including quite a few of our Luminaria events, which is a tradition all the way up the Rio Grande Valley, from Mesilla all the way up to Los Luceros and the Española area. So we're going to be doing that all the way up through Jemez Historic Site as well. When I first got to New Mexico, it was interesting. If you Google Luminaria and you find the Wikipedia page for Luminaria, Jemez Historic Site is the picture that's on there. So it's kind of the archetype for that.
Awesome.
If there is such a thing as a accolade from Wikipedia, I would say that would be it. We are certainly going to continue that tradition, and those particular programs, because they are so visual in nature, do translate well to a digital format. But there's a lot more to it than that as well, in terms of just the experience on site. It's not just the beautiful lights and the settings of the historic sites, it's the programming that goes along with it. At Jemez, the traditional dances from our Pueblo partners. At Los Luceros, the food traditions that we brought in last year and things of that nature. So our educators are figuring out ways to bring those experiences into the homes of the publics that we serve. Food is going to be a big part of what we do during the season, because all of us end up in the kitchen during this time of year. So that's going to be pretty exciting. And then we got some surprises as well. We're looking forward to being able to figure out unique ways to make these trying times a little more bearable, and to bring some joy into some families' homes, while also educating people about the traditions of the Southwest and New Mexico in particular.
The luminarias at Jemez in particular, they're beyond an archetype. Many people in New Mexico at some point have gone. And I realize that's just one program, but this year, just to draw a picture for our listeners, will you still be able to go, or is it going to be drive-through only, or is it going to be a drone tour that I can watch online, or...
It's not going to be an in-person event, unfortunately. So there, I think we're even planning on doing the program, and we don't want to set up something that people can get there and be like, well, why can't we come in? So we're actually being very strategic on when we do it. Fortunately, we already have all the resources. We think far in advance about our paper sacks and our sand and our candles, but actually we'll probably do things phased. And so right now we have a part of the program is going to be a concert held by our instructional coordinator, Marlon Magdalena, who does incredible flute music. Actually, we did our Fair New Mexico concert series with Department of Cultural Affairs. So we're really trying to create that dynamic to give people a virtual experience. Fortunately, we have a lot of footage from previous years. We worked with tourism, who took some incredible drone work last year. So the idea of doing something that's both live with the resources we have and setting up in various places, as well as augmenting that in conjunction with what we've had in the past. So it'll give viewers that, wow, this is really incredible, without having to actually be there.
But the live would be still online.
Right. We're sort of working through that. One of the issues of our partners that we've always done is dances with our Pueblo partners from Jemez, and they're in lockdown. They don't leave the Pueblo. So we may be recording things where they can do that on their Pueblo, out on the plaza, and then we'll tie them together. So there'll probably be a blend of live and virtual recorded.
And then, Tim, you mentioned about food and how you want to bring that into this kind of virtual holiday programming. Is that going to be like cooking lessons?
I think it's going to be a blend of a bunch of different programs related to traditional foodways, and it's going to be unique to each region as well. So obviously some of the traditions of northern New Mexico are very different than, say, the region that I'm in right now in Lincoln County, where we have two historic sites that are more connected to the American expansion westward. So our instructional coordinators down here are going to be doing some things related to, say, cooking at Fort Stanton, where isolation and being disconnected from family was very similar to kind of what we are right now. You know, I seriously doubt that I'm going to be able to see my family on the East Coast this year for the holidays, which is definitely disappointing and sad, but we'll figure out some way to stay connected. But it was a similar situation to some of those soldiers on the frontier, or some of the families that had immigrated here from the East Coast and the Midwest during that time. So it's going to be a blend of cooking kind of demonstrations. We're looking at doing a cookie decorating contest through Los Luceros. We did a apple pie contest back in the fall, around the time that we traditionally do our Apple Harvest Festival, and that was a huge success. So we're going to build on that. So we're going to be doing quite a bit of different programs around that, but also focusing not just on the actual creation of these culinary treats, but also the history and the cultural connections to New Mexico and the Southwest. Oftentimes we overlook these traditions. We just, my family always made this around the holidays. And then you find out where that tradition started and you're like, wow, that now has a lot more meaning to it.
I see that you have a lot of events with John Paul Taylor's family and John Paul Taylor, who's New Mexico's favorite grandpa. How are you drawing people in and making them feel like they're there or making them feel like they have a connection?
That's one of the challenges. I think as Tim commented, the cooking part is great because it resonates with people. I mean, we make the bizcochitos. I think that creates a connection to people. I think the nacimientos, the creches, that we have an incredible collection at the Taylors that Paul, 100 years old now, mind you, say, and he's more than happy to be New Mexico's grandpa. I think he'd love that. But this was the first program we started working on. They've already worked with the family, who are the only ones who have been inside of the house. None of our staff have seen Paul since March, but they're doing recordings of some of the history of the nacimientos so that people can see them. And then later in the year, the plan is to actually have the family work with us and we'll do a recording so people can be inside of the house. This is actually something that we do once a year, but it's for only that few people who can make it there. And this will be the first time that all New Mexicans or people who are interested in New Mexico around the world can come and experience something truly, truly incredible. Hopefully it'll be that moment of discovery. Very much the history and the culture of our people is a cornerstone of what we do in historic sites.
You've been through one holiday season already. I know you did some Day of the Dead events. How did those go?
The Day of the Dead event we covered from last year, so we actually highlighted things we did before. But we did do After Dark program, and Tim, that was an experience for you and the staff down there to create something being socially distant and apart from each other.
We haven't actually released that yet. We're still working on it. But as Patrick mentioned, we do some after dark tours in the Lincoln and Fort Stanton regions, which, provide an opportunity for people to kind of see the historic sites in a different way. We took those stories virtually this year, and we're in the process of putting those together as kind of a connected unit. I think the challenges of rethinking and retooling these programs for a virtual audience has been a challenge, but it also presents us with a lot of opportunity. The obvious thing is we can reach more people, right? Like Patrick mentioned, people all around the world now might be able to virtually meet J. Paul Taylor and learn about his passion for history and culture in New Mexico and so forth and so on. But even more than that, it's also allowed us to bring people into parts of the historic sites and during times that they normally could not. Something as simple as a video tour of the bell tower at the church in Lincoln. We can't allow people to go up there for a whole host of reasons, but we were able to virtually bring people up there and show them the bell that literally was been there since 1886. Things that people never think about. It's certainly been a challenge, but our educators and interpreters have found ways to open up the sites in new and exciting ways.
Do you think that because of the pandemic, it sounds like it's sort of spurred you on to do things you might have wanted to do anyway, like a video tour of a site that is off limits, but now there's a real impetus for getting it done quickly. Is that right?
No question. A lot of the things we've done in historic sites over the last 4 years have been incredible. Our staff is great in the way they're working and telling the history of New Mexico in different ways. But a lot of it, unfortunately, was sort of aspirational. The idea of having all of our instruction coordinators work together on a series of programs in tandem, they've done little things, but actually implementing that was more, this will be a slow process and having it evolve. And now one of the gifts, if you will, if there could be such a thing of a gift of COVID, is the gift of time. That while we unfortunately weren't doing what we love most, is being able to engage with our publics in person, suddenly now all of our staff are home. We didn't let the foot off the gas in the slightest. I mean, they were working constantly, and we've all gotten used to doing the Brady Bunch Zoom game, but by golly, they know each other and they work together, and the breakout rooms, which is a new feature in Zoom they rolled out. Now they've got different programs. Same thing with our Rangers. And so even the idea about how do we storytell is different. And I have to tell this, that one of our Rangers at Jemez, she is remarkable. A great ranger knows the story, but most of the time at Jemez, you sit behind the desk and you welcome people and you tell them where to go. And you're not really capitalizing on their expertise. And in creating some of these Ranger Talk programs, because we had time, this was not part of her background, but boy, does she leap in. And talking about the Orno, what does the Orno mean? How do people use it? Because so many of our visitors come by, they see the Orno, they've seen them in people's yards as they drive around to Mexico. And it was wonderful to watch her put this together. And so, yes, the opportunity we've had to do something really dynamic and really different is incredible. This is going to be a long-term benefit that we're going to have out of this because everybody is ready to work. I think when we did reopen, there was a little trepidation of, yay, we get to be back. but I also don't get to see my colleagues quite as much. We said, well, we'll keep making sure everybody has a time that we can still work together virtually, even when we're past all of this.
That's fantastic. You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
Thank you both so much for talking with us today. This is just so interesting hearing about how you're celebrating throughout the winter season without allowing anybody to come and gather and celebrate in person. And I guess I want to look back a little bit to the summertime. You all pivoted during the pandemic really quickly. And you had online summer camps and you had classroom programs sort of ready to go pretty fast. And so what did those look like when you were reaching out and trying to engage kids? You know, maybe normally the parents would pack their kids up and send them off, but all these kids are sitting at home with their screens. What does summer camp and virtual classrooms look like when you're doing it all online?
Thank you. Thank you for acknowledging that we did pivot quickly. There were a lot of DCA entities that were challenged with that, and they came up with some things quickly. We could do book reading programs, etc. I think the reason we were able to pivot quickly was because of the quality of staff that we have. When we started interviewing instructional coordinators back in 2016 and all the way along, it was, tell us what you know about doing programming around Common Core curriculum standards for the state of New Mexico. And if you had a blank look, it was kind of well, we got a little hill to climb. And so we hired people and they were ready. And we've been implementing this along the way. They were ready to jump into the fray right away. And we've done so many innovative ways of storytelling rather than saying, well, this is our site and this is what happened here. But how do we communicate that to a range of audiences? And the value, too, is working around standards is that they really ask sets of questions for different age groups. And while they're developed around K-12 education, they're equally applicable to everybody all the way up to senior groups who come in on hostel tours. We had a lot of ability in our hand, but the challenge of getting it done is how do we integrate those into ways that are going to continue to tell that story? And it was a challenge at first because one, people had not been Zooming. They had not been working in this format. And this is really where we've got great staff. And we had the kind of technology resources at our disposal and how to use them was great. Tim Roberts comes from a long background of doing digital media. Ethan Ortega, who's our manager up at Los Luceros. I'm seeing heads nod. Ethan's a rock star and really has created some dynamic ways of thinking. And even in a previous time, I think a lot of people on our staff have skills. So when we were able to start blending them together, they were able to roll them out relatively quickly. And the great part of it was the connection we quickly discovered as we were putting them up by teachers around the state. The response we had for them, thank you for creating something. We're trying to build things around. And sometimes it's how do we look at STEM issues with historic sites, which you wouldn't think about. But we could talk about a lot of facets. How does water flow? How does parabolas work when it comes to projectiles? And so tying that in was great. And we pretty much ran that through the remainder of the school year. And that's when we jumped into recognizing that so many New Mexicos were going to be without summer camps. My children are at home and usually they would have these enriching experiences. So that's when we started putting together this list of virtual summer camps. I'll be straight up. I thought I was keeping tabs on everything that was coming out. I was checking them all as they were coming through and they're like, these are great. And I'm posting on my own Facebook page. I love my staff. But it wasn't until a couple months ago that I had to go back and find one, and I was scrolling down. I know where it was. The dozens of these things that our staff put out. It was just incredible, the variety of things. And they've got a whole series of things that are loaded. And Tim, he was really key in kind of helping work people around. Hey, I've got an idea. Let's run with it. It was always about how can we build the fire and get excited about things.
I have to say, I checked out some of the summer camp sessions, and the programs that I checked out were really well done, really high quality. Did you all have some sort of quality management? How did all these interpreters and rangers end up being such good video producers and new media experts? I know you had some expertise on the staff to start with, but did people have to learn a lot? Did people teach each other?
I'll take one quick step back. Obviously, we're going through the worst public health crisis in over 100 years here in the United States right now. So it's hard to sometimes find a silver lining in that. But one of the things that really presented itself as an opportunity for us early on during the pandemic was that we could kind of take a step back and kind of self-evaluate what we were doing with historic sites. And we had lofty aspirations and plans to really increase our foundational training for our interpretive staff over the last 3 years. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, they were too busy. Right? We have 8 historic sites across the state, and we do dozens of events during the year and 400 acres of property to manage and over 100 historic structures. So it's sometimes difficult to get that foundational training. So when the historic sites first shut down in March, the first thing we did was get all of our educators together, all of our interpreters together, and really just take a step back and refocus our energy in best practices in interpretation, really kind of rebaptize ourselves in what we do as public historians and interpreters. And I think that really was the foundation on which all these programs were built. The ultimate goal of any interpretive program is to create that emotional connection with the visitor so that visitor understands why that resource needs protecting or needs conserving. And that's a really broad way of putting it, but that's the crux of it. If we can impart to somebody when they come visit our sites why this is important, why it matters to them by developing some sort of connection to a universal concept that they relate to, even if they're not from the Southwest, if they're all the way from New York City or something like that, that's what we need to do. So by really focusing on that with these virtual summer camps and our education programs and making that the critical element, I think that's why they succeeded. And it didn't matter whether or not we were talking about apple harvesting at Los Luceros or public health in New Mexico at Fort Stanton. Our rangers and our educators were able to find those ways to connect with the public and bring those to a virtual format. So I think that was why we succeeded. Now, technologically speaking, there was a learning curve. Not all of our educators and interpreters had experience in digital humanities, but they understood the importance of the work we were doing and they jumped in head first. They worked together, a lot of collaboration in terms of how to pull these things off. And again, another silver lining of this, as Patrick mentioned before, was the fact that they could more easily come together with the tools that we were using to communicate. Everybody's been able to elevate themselves to a new level of interpretation, I think, and teach themselves new skills to keep ourselves relevant and keep doing what we love to do, engaging with the public.
I'm hearing something really critical here. It sounds like certainly a silver lining of the pandemic was, in a sense, extended professional development that allows you to kind of refocus on the very mission of the department and why you're doing this. And I get how if you're not spending your whole day, in a sense, doing visitor management, collecting visitor fees and where's the bathroom and some kid who threw up out in the parking lot, that you can spend time on your interpretive work. But I'm curious, the pandemic's not going to go on forever, or at least I'm presuming that it's not. Are you thinking about or talking about how to keep that interpretive momentum going when people are back at the sites and keeping that work going without falling back into what might have been the old routine? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. This has always been the dream about how do we go about doing this. And a lot of the things that we're putting into place are designed to have both virtual and on the ground legs. I mentioned the Orno program that our staff member put together. That's something that can be done in person too. And how do we move forward that? And how do we continue this relationship? How do we continue this connection to our public and telling our stories is going to be critical. And I think at the same time, it's also opened a new way of thinking that people who have had to step outside for 9 months about, well, I get up and I go and do this. I think those things are really cool and I'd love to get to it. Now I've done it. We actually already saw this starting to manifest itself when people are coming through the door on that 1 month. Let me tell you about some really cool things. Did you know what you can do with yucca? Great. So I think that it's going to be transformative. Not to jump too far ahead, but we're looking at our junior ranger programs, which we're kind of figuring out a new term for that. But those are elements too that are going to be universal. So if you happen to come into the state of New Mexico from the east and you visit Bosque Redondo, you're going to discover there's something else to learn at Coronado and Jemez. And if you go south to Taylor and Zelda, or if you go into the Sacramentos, you're going to be down there with Stanton and Lincoln. What can I discover? What can I learn? And those programs are going to be integrated to the point where I see the bigger whole as a result of it. So there are a lot of other elements that are sort of emerging in tandem with this as all ships rise with this opportunity. It should be great for the foreseeable future. We hope this is, I know it's a no term, the new normal for the way we operate.
I have some questions about how you taking the lessons that you learned by doing the virtual summer camps in the virtual classroom and carrying them through to these holiday and seasonal celebrations. What kind of offerings are you going to have for kids? What did you learn that you're carrying through and using in your programming for reaching younger audiences?
The just sheer number of programs that our staff was able to put together over the last 8 months, 9 months, my goodness, it's been that long. We've learned quite a bit about what works, what doesn't work, what resonates with people, the sorts of activities and things of that nature. And, it's not always about the heavier approach to interpretation. Sometimes it's just doing something a little lighter. I think we can all use that right now. Our interpretive staff are going to be doing a variety of activities. One thing we did find that really resonated well with people was the idea of creating something in tandem with our rangers and interpretive staff. So whether that's a craft or an activity or something like that, we actually took our virtual programs from 2 different sites. We actually came into the home physically a little bit in the sense that we created packets that we worked with the state library system to distribute to children across northern and central New Mexico from Bosque Redondo and programming there, and then also Los Luceros.
Physical packets?
Yep. They were sent out through the library system and through the school system. Actually, some of them were even handed out at bus stops when lunches were being handed out up in northern New Mexico. And so kids could actually follow along those activities. We provided the materials for them, and then it was augmented by the virtual elements as well. So also, there are certain things that just are kind of universal to cultures across the world, food being one, and then music being another. So we're going to be doing quite a few programs that integrate both of those kind of cultural elements that are so critical around the holidays. So I think it's going to be a meaningful holiday season for us at Historic Sites, and we're just excited about sharing some of our favorite traditions with a broader public.
I think it's really cool that you're trying to get some physical stuff into people's hands also, because I think a lot of people are sort of missing anything to do with stuff that's not little heads on screen this year. Before I forget, I do want to circle back to something that came up at the beginning of this segment, which is you had mentioned that as part of the summer camps, you're hitting some Common Core standards in the curricula. So am I correct in that some of these new hybrid programs that you're developing are actually sort of ready to go if teachers want to use them in the classrooms? I mean, that this is something that they absolutely can use to hit their standards.
Absolutely. That's really been the goal we've had from the outset. And we understand that dollars are scarce and that resources are scarce and time is scarce. The way that teachers have to fit everything within a certain set of boxes. Growing up here in New Mexico, we went and did our 4th grade trip to the Palace of the Governors. And, you learned about it. I'm not exactly sure what that fit. I guess that was the year we were teaching New Mexico history. So it did fit. Oh my gosh, realization. But we're realizing that for all of our areas, there's an opportunity to do something that's going to check the boxes. And you hate to say that checking the boxes is important, but it is.
It is.
For teachers. It's important. And how is it that we tie those parts together so that if you're online, you can do it? And we've had connections from people who do homeschooling who said, these are great. And you want them not just to fit the box when they come out, but for our young people to say, I know about my state. And I think as Tim touched on earlier, we want every New Mexican to be able to see themselves why it matters. Even somebody who travels from out of state or from another country, when they come to our historic site, our goal is to say, I see how I connect to this place in one way or another. Then we're doing our job correctly.
You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
Again, thanks for your time today. And thanks for coming and talking with us about all your exciting winter celebrations that you have going on. Can we talk a little bit more specifically about some of the programs that you all have planned? Whether it's the Luminaria or it's the Bizcochitos, how are these programs designed to be different things to different people while conveying a sense of place and history and tradition?
Yeah, so a lot of the programs, as I think a lot of your listeners, a lot of our guests know, are annual. They're seasonal events. And how are we modifying those and bringing them to the public in ways that they can experience and enjoy remotely for the first time? And it's required some thinking. So many of the things we do, long-term trajectory about how can we make amazing things happen for our guests and the people of New Mexico who maybe are reliable volunteers who are there every week, or somebody who maybe has never visited a historic site before and they're going to discover it. We've watched our social media outreach leap from just 300, I think, in 2016 to 35,000. And these are active followers. So we're getting a lot of people. And I think we know that these are important. We've seen my first year when I came, our first Light Among the Ruins up at Jemez, we had 800 people. And then we've had to move to ticketed just because we had so many, 5,000 people, which made the community of Jemez Springs happy. But along the way, when those roads were pretty packed all the way from the turnoff on 550 coming up. So we figured out how do we navigate? We're working with public safety, etc. It's a challenge. But I think we're learning along the way that there's some things, you know what would be really cool to do with this program is connecting food in some ways. Or why don't we start talking about traditions? Some of the folks who say, I've got an idea, but I've never really been able to implement it. And how can we take some of those ideas and turn them into something real? And in many ways, the idea of having a conversation about food is really not viable for 5,000 people coming through and in blocks of half-hour windows where you can stay as long as you like, but, you know, people are cold and they come and it's beautiful and you leave. It's a small site. And so there are some opportunities here. We have that. But we're looking, since we have so much space at Los Luceros, of doing a drive-through. So it'll be a blend where you can do some things at home, and then hopefully people may be able to drive through and be able to set it up. You won't be able to get out of your car, but you can come and it'll be beautiful. And that doesn't mean that we're entirely going to be 100% Jemez. There's no way we can accommodate people. One way or another, we'll try and make these connections. And then there's some of those events, the Nacimientos down at the Taylor property. Those are beautiful too. And we know that we're going to be reaching people we've never seen before. We're really looking for a very wonderful, warm season where people can experience something. But that doesn't mean that we're letting the history go to the side. Our Letters from the Fort program at Bosque Redondo, it's a little heavy. I mean, we have the American concentration camp story, but there are a lot of narratives from different cultural groups and from different perspectives that we really bring to the front. And we've been doing this in person for years, so it organically lends itself to doing a live program. There are just a lot of ways that people are going to learn an awful lot about their state in ways that they never would have if we didn't have this pandemic.
I'm a little curious about some of your Bosque Redondo programs. You have some recipe days planned. And what is the Slim Fast Coffee recipe day?
You know, we love our Navajo taco. Man, that is a staple of Fiesta and the Joy. When the Navajo people were forced to relocate and come to Bosque Redondo, Fort Sumner, they were given rations that they'd never seen before. They had things like here's oil and here's flour and coffee. And, a lot of them ate the flour raw, and of course that made them ill. So then they figured they could take the very salty water from the Pecos River and they could blend it together and put it in the oil and make fry bread. Growing up here, I will say that the story of the Bosque Redondo is relatively new to the vernacular. I have a master's degree in history from New Mexico State, and even taking New Mexico's history, that part was very glossed over. And that wasn't that many years ago. But one of the things that they did have was coffee. Our new exhibit is actually in the final phases of installation at Bosque Redondo. It's going to be beautiful when it opens. They were actually coming to install, what was it, Tim? This last week, they were going to start installation. So we're all on hold. But one of the things we've learned about on the Navajo Nation, that instant coffee is part of their traditions that have come back. It's sort of these roots and that notion of survival and endurance that the Navajo people hold. So there's some stories to be told which are really meaningful for the Navajo people. And that's not for us to tell them. That's their story to tell and how they communicated. And so we bring a lot of that to the forefront.
So how did you get some of that reinterpretation of those stories? Do you have people in the community that came to you with those stories? I mean, you said you didn't even learn about this getting your master's at New Mexico State.
Actually, the Bosque Redondo story, that really changed. And I think there was actually a letter that was left at Bosque Redondo 30 years ago, this last June, where there was a group of Navajo who came to a place that they weren't supposed to go to, Huelde, the place of suffering. And they went and they visited. And it's a fort. And, there were some Indians. And this is where the fort was. And they flew the flag. And they said, this is terrible. We demand that you tell what happened here. And they left this letter. And this letter has become the focal point for how we have transformed talking about this horrifically terrible, terrible place for the Mescalero Apache and the Navajo. And because of that, it's been a long road. We're 30 years where we've grappled with how do you tell this? We, as the state of New Mexico, cannot tell that story for them. They have to tell that story. And so we work very, very closely with the Navajo Nation Museum, actually all the way up to Vice President Nez. He and a group ran back from Bosque Redondo for the anniversary of their independence, the creation of the Navajo Nation. It's not a temporary, tell us what you think and we'll put it up, but rather the connection we have and the collaboration we have with the Mescalero Apache and the Navajo Nation as active partners is very much at the heart of how this exhibit came about. And so being able to talk about those stories from their point of view, they're sharing those stories. They're their stories that they're bringing to the forefront. The exhibit is powerful and dynamic and beautiful and tragic all at the same time.
It's been nice having the virtual events for people who can't get all the way out there. This is what I've heard from around the country is people have been doing virtual events. All the people who wouldn't have been able to make the live events or wouldn't have been able to get out there can participate in ways. Have you been getting feedback from people around the state about they're more interested in a place because they never had a chance to visit it?
Absolutely. And I think you touched on it. Some of the events, the letters programs that we do a couple of times a year. There's a holiday seasonal letters from the fort, as well as a mid-year letters from the fort. And our ranger there, she did a multi-week-long book club program where they talked about it. It was for young people, but it was powerful. And it was amazing where you watched the number of people who would start to tune in every Saturday, and we're part of that. And during that short time that we were open, we were visited by a lot of people who had discovered us because of the programming we did for the year. So while we would have a handful, and you hate to say it was sort of the same people who were coming to our letters programs, community members who came, they were very meaningful, they were very powerful. But now you're opening up the door to thousands and thousands of potential people who discover us because we have so many followers and the numbers just continue to grow.
How are you doing the outreach to let people know that these programs were now existing online or in some kind of virtual context?
A lot of it is Facebook, honestly, and then we also have Twitter, we have Instagram, etc. But you have that growing number of followers for New Mexico historic sites, and it continues, and then somebody likes it, and they follow it, and then that shares. It's been very organic. And discovering the numbers of people from interesting places. And we do support boosting. We have a company that we work with, Simply Social. They've been just amazing in guiding us and supporting us and bringing it forward. But even in our Light Among the Ruins program last year, an incredible number of people were coming down from Pueblo, Colorado, because they discovered it. It's like, it's not that far. It's 4 hours away. We'll drive down. We'll see it. And so we're starting to recognize, gosh, we have this incredible following from a town north of New Mexico who are making the trek. And we discovered that only because we were selling tickets online. So you get your window to come in. And you're like, look at all these people from Pueblo who are popping up buying tickets. Like, cool. You just never know. And watching those work outward. And our neighbors in Texas, they're big supporters. Lincoln, Fort Stanton, Bosque Redondo. We found a lot of them coming over during the short time we were open.
I'm a little curious just to loop back around to some of your community partnerships. I mean, we've talked about partnerships with the Jemez and partnerships with the Taylor family and how embedded these places are in certain communities. And so it sort of sounds like you've got this balance of involving the community and presenting it to the world at large or to the state at large. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the programs that you have going on in the month of December and how they're involving some of the communities like Los Luceros or Jemez or with the Taylor House?
A lot of the times, it's kind of changing the way our narrative is focused, has opened doors to conversations we've never had before. Working with Moving Arts and Española, with Mesa Prieta and the petroglyphs, and how can those stories overlap with each other? How to the culture of northern New Mexico, working with Okeowinge, and the fact that this is their ancestral homelands. Sure, Jemez is logical because the Pueblo has been a close partner. We work hand in hand with their tribal preservation office, but the community of Jemez Springs has been embracing us in different ways, and even Coronado. As you know, even the name of Coronado was sort of a question because for a long time, Coronado was never there until we discovered, well, he kind of was there because they did an assault from the north on the Pueblo and they never breached the walls, which in itself says, yeah, Coronado's here, but he kind of lost. We're still dealing with the archaeology that's going on. But as a result of saying, how are we going to better tell the story? All of the pueblos that surround Coronado, as well as the community, are all working closely about how can we have that conversation.
So we have specific projects going on at all the historic sites. I mean, our community partners are critical to having that. It is a little strange not being on site. Our friends groups are integral partners in developing all of our programming, especially during the holiday season. But they are certainly still involved in unique ways, whether that's the seasonal tea that we have at Fort Stanton, the events up in Jemez as well. So, we're finding new ways to work with our community partners in this time and just continuing to move things forward.
Right now, this is a work in progress. Right now, the schedule is sort of developing as we speak. And as some of our rangers pointed out, we don't need to recreate the wheel. You've got great artists and storytellers and chefs. And we're privileged to have spaces where we can work with them. And the fact that you can do things digitally like this, there are ways of finding out who are those people within our neighboring communities who can bring something to bear. So it's not our staff alone who are doing the lift, but rather we're working with other people to bring the cultures of New Mexico to the forefront in this. And we hope this is in its infancy, that next year that we'll be back doing our normal programs, but that doesn't mean that our virtual type activities have to slow down in the slightest.
Has there been a community connection that's been made because of some of this kind of virtual outreach and looking for new ways to tell these stories and make connections that was really surprising or unexpected, where you made this kind of connection with someone in the community that just wouldn't have happened in 2019?
Probably the most interesting thing that I've seen is just the sheer scope of how farther our reach is. We had people tuning in to a indigenous flute concert at Jemez from Germany and making the connection between traditional music there and what was developed here in the Southwest. In terms of new types of groups that we've reached out to, we started a folk music festival at Fort Stanton last year in 2019 was the first year, but we had to take it completely virtual this year. It certainly had its technical challenges, but we worked with our friends group at Fort Stanton to pull that off. And we were reaching people all the way across the country and beyond just because of the groups that we were able to bring in and the type of music that we were able to present. There have been unique opportunities for sure.
It seems like we've heard over and over from both of you how your reach is larger than you thought it was. That must be really gratifying to know that it's meaningful.
You're really reaching people and engaging them.
And sometimes they come in unexpected ways. Right after the pandemic started, we had a fire at Los Luceros. And this required our staff to race into action in the middle of a pandemic. But we also had PED. You also had agriculture department who came. People showed up with animal trailers. Dozens of these small communities dotted across northern New Mexico sent fire crews to help. And nothing happened. They were able to stop it at our property line. And at the same time, all of those people who were there, we express our thanks, but suddenly they have a connection to this site. So there's a lot of success stories that somehow we're making connections in ways that you wouldn't necessarily have thought were going to happen before 2020 showed up.
You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
I'm really enjoying talking with you all today about your shift from presenting in-person experiences to presenting online experiences that have a similar impact. I wanted to ask a little bit about some of your methods and approaches for doing place-based interpretation when you don't have your audience in the place you're interpreting. Some of the other organizations that I've seen who have been trying to make this transition have used different technology to give a sense of a place. I've noticed you all do things like using immersive 360 photography to present things. And what are some of your favorite tools for giving a sense of place when people are at home?
It's a great question, and a lot of it is almost more important than the technology that we're quick to adapt, but it's the way of thinking, how we go about doing this, how we practice our craft. The nuts and bolts that people don't see is the amount of time that Tim and our incredible rangers, our incredible instructional coordinators have worked with. There are templates. We work with our templates and say, how do we tell the story? How are we hitting the audiences? Who matters? And I think it really goes back to some of the crux when Tim and I first came and joined Cultural Affairs in 2016. The big question we asked, and it always is at the forefront, is so what? So what? If we're not answering the question of why does this place matter? Okay, well, there's some ruins here, and so what? We want everybody to understand why it matters and why it matters to them as people. And how we go about integrating those conversations have been at the heart of what we've done for a long time. So the question framing, the question asking about how we do this really goes back into how we just approach these things. And are we succeeding in reaching those people? So then the technology part starts to come in. But even branching out and saying, what are best practices out there in the rest of the world? We're not working in a vacuum, and there's no reason for us to create the wheel from scratch when it's out there. One of the other advantages is that this year, we as a division are members of the American Association of State and Local History, which is a consortium of thousands of professionals across the country. And they had their conference this year that was virtual. And so we paid for all of our staff to attend the conference. And fortunately, unlike every conference I've ever been to in my life, it's like, there are 3 overlapping concurrent sessions and I want to see them all. And you get up and you leave and people are like, what? You hate me? I'm like, no. But here you're able to record them. And it's been great. I just found out Monday that one of our most seasoned employees, who really didn't have a background in this, but incredibly knowledgeable, went to these sessions and it's just, this is amazing. I've got all these great ideas and we could do these things. That's the kind of inspiration and thinking that you need, because that engages it to say, all right, now we know that we want to tell the story and here are some of the options of doing it. And the equipment, the 3D cameras, the recording devices, we bought resources for people. Even knowing that we're facing very tight budgetary constraints, we will spend the money on the resources so that our staff can start to engage in these ways, knowing that it's not for a short term, but for a long term. And Tim, you've been at the heart of how are we going to go about executing this. Maybe you want to share some of the highlights along the way about what we've done.
I think Patrick's 100% right. As public historians and interpreters of cultural resources, the idea of digital humanities, we have to look at it as just another tool in our toolbox. At the end of the day, there's 100 different ways or 1,000 different ways to skin the cat in terms of how you present this program or make that connection with the public. And it doesn't matter whether or not you're standing physically on the site, maybe giving a living history presentation, or whether or not you're interacting with somebody over a Zoom call, or you're presenting something through a social media platform like TikTok. The bottom line is, are you making that connection with people? And I think that was really the critical element in terms of getting our staff engaged with this, is just to kind of peel away some of what I would consider the fear of using these new technologies, and just reminding them that at the heart of this, they are the professionals, they're the ones who have the knowledge. This is just another tool in terms of how we interpret. It doesn't matter if you've never done a Facebook Live video. There's no difference really between that and, say, standing in front of a group of school children at the Mesilla Plaza or Los Suceros or something like that. I think once they kind of overcame that and realized that we have the resources to help them reach a broader audience, that was really where the light bulb came on. And I think our virtual summer camps and our lesson plans they're all based in the same tried and true interpretive processes that we use on site, but now we're just transitioning them into something unique and exciting. And I've seen our interpreters get rejuvenated about that, because sometimes you get stuck in a rut. You're kind of presenting the same material in the same way over and over again, and it's rewarding and fulfilling. That's what we do. But when all of a sudden you can reach a school child in, say, New York or Maine or Florida or Germany for that matter, it's a reaffirmation about what we do. There are a lot more ways to digitize humanities than just scanning documents into an archive. There's a lot more to it than that.
Tim, given how many new technologies, and by new I mean in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years that have come online, whether it's immersive panoramas or being able to take inexpensive aerial footage with a drone, or even something simple like taking a high-res HD phone and being able to record, say, what I would think of as an oral history from a member of the community. Have you and your people been coming up with sort of a decision tree in deciding what tool would be best for telling a given story, or do you all just sort of toss that around ad hoc? Because what I'm hearing from both of you is the story and the meaning and the importance of the story is what comes first, and then you decide what interpretive tool is the best tool for that, whether it's a new digital tool or an old school living history interpretive tool. How do you go about kind of making those decisions as you're going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with the individual interpreter and what he or she is familiar with and comfortable with. At the very beginning, we do have a process. The interpretive process doesn't really change regardless of what medium you're using. We start from the beginning and work our way up. And then once we get to that point where we kind of decided what that universal concept is, what that connection we're trying to make is to the resource, then we can look at the tools in our toolbox and say, okay, well, maybe something as simple as a video of you presenting the interpretive program would be good, right? Or maybe it is, an immersive experience with a 3D camera or something like that. A lot of it's trial and error too. So we've definitely come across some things that really work in certain scenarios and maybe things that don't work so well with certain scenarios. It's really difficult to explain to someone what, say, an apple pie smells like over a video call, but there are ways of bringing that into their home. And we leave a lot of that up to our individual interpreters, because that's how they would be doing it in the field, right? They're creating these interpretive programs, and they're the ones who are going to come to us and say, what I think would be really good here is, a hands-on activity. We're going to take this cultural topic and figure out a way to integrate it with, say, a STEM activity. They've come up with a lot of different ideas, and our virtual summer camps, I think, reflected that, since it was all over the board in the way that they were engaging with people.
As Tim said, there's a learning curve. And you dip your toe into it. I may not be comfortable with that. Maybe I'll try a podcast. Well, come March, everybody got thrown into the deep end of the pool in tandem. No! And we had some leaders. Ethan Ortega, our manager at Los Luceros, he's a front runner. He brings things to our table. I mean, I spent 20 years almost teaching museum studies, interpretation, exhibit kind of things. If you could only do this, how great it would be. They can now. And Ethan just got his master's degree in museum studies at UNM. Great program. Boy, the things he brings to the table is like, this is fantastic. The digital mapping, I know you did a program on that for our exhibit up at Jemez. How can we use some of these things? How can we do virtual tours with the augmented reality and walk around? And even if you're not on site, how can you do things? So there are those layers. And as Tim said, you look at what people's interests are or their skill sets. And it's interesting when you go back and watch some of our first programs, there's some rough edges, and that's okay. And then you watch they become increasingly more polished. And that's saying, what can we do? Just last week, our instructional coordinator at Los Luceros, Carly, said, could we start a TikTok channel? And my reaction was, seriously, TikTok? What? But, sure, go for it. And now they've created these TikToks that are, granted, earworms of an epic proportion, but they're adorable. But they do also tell stuff. And if you're reaching a different audience who's going to discover this, because this is a link to go back to that. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunities here, and really embracing the skills of the staff. Go be creative, go be innovative, be excited about this. This is a time of continued growth at a pace that we never could have imagined happening otherwise.
What I'm hearing is allowing people the room to fail or to have things not work out. I personally think that's critical to actually doing good work, because sometimes you try stuff and it doesn't work out, but that's how you learn. And it's also how people get comfortable taking a risk, because otherwise people become really risk averse. I'm curious, with all that in mind, Is there an example, a very specific example of one of these newer projects from the last, say, 6 or 8 months that was a real success, like succeeded beyond what you thought it would be, but also is there something that just was a spectacular fail?
Well, I can speak to the success, but Tim, you think about a fail. I'll throw you under the bus. I don't think anybody's getting embarrassed. We took down the ones that were epic fails, but the summer concert series, when it says, could we do this? That was just a triumph for not just historic sites, but for cultural affairs overall. And it continues to be a triumph. And it sort of cut the way to say, this is something that we should do.
Just taking a step back, I don't think that anything that we've done would be considered a failure in terms of the interpretive approach or things like that, because if we ground ourselves in that, we're always going to have success. Now, that doesn't mean that the tool will always work, right? Probably the biggest thing we fight with, public expectations for quality of content has gone up so much that something as simple as poor network connection can completely derail a project. So our folk festival is probably the best thing I can think of. Taking a step back, we did a live question and answer with a couple members of a paranormal organization that came and worked at Fort Stanton. And I specifically went to a place that I knew had an amazing network connection. And I should have done that during the folk festival, and I didn't, because it was easier and more convenient to do it, in a space that we had here. And unfortunately, some of the audio quality wasn't as good as it could have been. But we still had a great turnout and people enjoyed it. But we certainly could have done a better job by pre-recording something like that to eliminate some of those problems. And it's certainly not something that we have an issue with. I follow some people who have been doing this for a long time and they run into technical issues like that. But I think that's probably the biggest concern. And just getting our interpretive staff who are not as familiar with some of these technologies to figure out how to use them themselves. Once they're familiar with them, usually they're off to the races.
You said paranormal at Fort Stanton. Did I hear that accurately?
Yes. Back in November of 2019, we invited the ghost hunters, who at that point were on A&E, to come out and do an investigation at Fort Stanton. And they did, and they released that episode back in March or April, I think, right as we were closing down, actually. And then we invited 2 members of the cast back to do a kind of online post-mortem, no pun intended, of the investigation after it aired. And that was a resounding success because we were able to make it a live question and answer session. It was neat because they actually used quite a bit of new technology during that investigation, including an electron multiplying camera, which is something they hadn't used before. And they caught what I would consider unique evidence on it, something that's kind of being talked about in the paranormal investigation community. So we've already had a lot of people interested in coming back to Fort Stanton and investigating out there.
That's really cool. Actually, I'm going to have to go find it online and check it out. Before we finish up this segment, you have a lot of programs that you're doing in this new sort of virtual way for the end of the year celebrations. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you all would like to let everybody know about?
Having folk follow us, keep your eyes out to things that are happening, not just within historic sites, but all of cultural affairs. It's a difficult time for all of us, and I think that we're really trying to bring something new and very special to our publics in ways. So we're excited at the opportunity, and we hope that people will join us for whichever parts they can. When we're done, come back and visit us when we're back open again.
Patrick, Tim, thank you both so much for being with us today and telling us about what you're up to. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And if you all would like more information about what the department is doing, you can visit nmhistoricsites.org online. You can also follow the department on Facebook or subscribe to their YouTube channel. Just Google New Mexico Historic Sites. Augmented Humanity is a program of the New Mexico Humanities Council, produced in partnership with KUNM-FM. You can visit us online and find out more about our programs at nmhumanities.org. Our theme music comes courtesy James Whiten, and we've had production assistance from Tristan Klum.